Welcome back to Archaeology After Dark, everybody. I know it's been a little while since you've heard from me, but we're back with some really great stuff. My guest today is Dr. Catherine Tucker. Catherine, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I love the opportunity to get to talk about one of my passions.
So, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a environmental and economic anthropologist. I grew up in South Dakota and Minnesota, and now I'm at the University of Florida by way of Indiana University. My work has started out being very interested in contexts in which communities self-organize to manage their natural resources. I did my doctoral research in Honduras, where I still work today, and I was studying community forestry, a really interesting community that had actually kicked out a parastatal timber company. Uh, and so I went there to work, but while I was there, they started cutting down some of their communal forests to plant coffee. And so I started looking at coffee. And for many of these people in a rather remote mountainous area of Western Honduras, coffee was the first time they had the chance to actually make money from the market. And so I started trying to understand what coffee offered, how it affected people's lives and their livelihoods and their outlook. And it's a really mixed bag. And so I've come across the recent decades and the good fortune to get funding to work with several multinational teams studying coffee and the coffee crisis, certifications and other dimensions of coffee to really see coffee as a way of understanding the global economic system and the challenges we face for building a more sustainable world, more sustainable economy that's more equitable, and also for thinking about how do we uh, live constructively in the world without destroying it. And curiously enough, a lot of the things that have been happening in coffee are providing some clues for, at least within certain contexts, what people can do. And I really admire the co-ops and organizations that I'm working with because they keep figuring out ways to adapt to the all of the stresses that they face, which include environmental change, climate change. They've had a bunch of hurricanes go through, which being in Florida, I'm very sympathetic to, and how they're thinking about interacting with the market so that they can have more secure livelihoods. And so that's kind of like in broad terms what I've been looking at and studying and also working on collaboratively with some really great organizations in Honduras.
So that leads us to what we're talking about today. We're talking about coffee not just as a substance, but as a global commodity. Would I be accurate in calling it a global commodity, first of all?
Absolutely. It is one of the most ubiquitous global commodities that there is.
Yeah, we actually talked about this before we started the episode that Catherine and I, have several colleagues, throughout various institutions across the world that, maintain not only themselves but their careers just by drinking coffee. So,
Yeah, there is a kind of a joke among those of us who study coffee is that, by some measures, which are a bit debatable, but in broad terms, you could think of the leading commodity in the world as being oil, and the next one is being coffee. So petroleum makes the world run, and coffee makes the people run who run the world.
so how did coffee go from, a simple agricultural staple to the commodity that it is now?
Well, that is a really interesting story, and it has a lot of different threads to it. But if we go back to when coffee first appears to have hit the historical records. And of course, there were probably earlier records that have been lost, but that goes back to about 1000 AD. And a physician known as Avicenna, who evidently was talking about coffee when he talked about a yellowish bean that was good for cleaning the humors of the body and helping with a number of maladies. So 1000 AD, more or less, we have the first recognition of coffee that we're pretty confident about in the historical record. And before that time, it was probably used as ground up in some sort of a gorp that some of the tribes in Ethiopia were using. What is now, of course, Ethiopia. Coffee originated in the northeastern sort of quadrant of Africa, and from there it spread, but it really only became a commodity around during the 1600s. And Europe was starting, of course, to reach out its colonial conquests and ambitions. And so coffee was not a huge agricultural product before that. But it was valued. For example, we know that the Sufis used it in their rituals to help them stay awake. And there was an interesting intersection with Islam because, by some accounts, it should be forbidden because it was charred. And according to the Quran, you shouldn't eat charred food. While others said, no, really, this is a gift from Allah because of all of its good qualities. So there was quite a bit of controversy when coffee was becoming established. And because it wasn't wine in the Middle Eastern Islamic world, it was something that people could drink, and it became a way for people to socialize that wasn't really viewed as in violation of the principles of Islam. So it began to spread, and through the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, it became something that was produced for trade. And a lot of wars were fought over areas that produced coffee, and a lot of the colonizing entities aimed to plant coffee so that they could benefit from it. And then, of course, you have this intersection with the Industrial Revolution, which, along with tea, was a way for people to stay awake. So basically, in very broad terms, we see the spread of coffee in association with the spread of colonialism, the rise of the mercantilism in the global north, and then with the rise of the Industrial Revolution. And coffee becomes something that is part of many people's lives. There's sort of like the tea drinking countries and the coffee drinking countries, but it seems like in a world that became more technically oriented and fixed to time, measured in ever more accurate minutes and seconds and nanoseconds, that being able to use caffeine in ways that could keep us awake and alert was ever more valued. So there's a close link between coffee, the rising demand for coffee, and the changes that happened with the rise of the modern global system. I hope that sort of gives, very generally sort of, the pattern.
Yeah, and that leads me to my next question. As I guess the world became more technological with the Industrial Revolution, it made it easier for coffee to grow in places that it didn't naturally occur, I assume.
Yes, well, one of the interesting things about coffee is that it is although it can be delicate in its early years, It tends to be a pretty durable crop once it is established. It's perennial and it grows really well in shade. And it was very easy for it to adapt without too much bother to many of the tropical montane areas around the world. And that's particularly true of Arabica coffee, which is one of the two main varieties of or species of coffee that are really, really dominant, Arabicas and Robustas. And then Robustas could grow when they were discovered in areas that were hotter and flatter and had more extreme temperatures. But Arabicas are the most popular coffee because they're a bit milder and really they can grow almost anywhere where you have good soils and a sort of moderate temperature where it doesn't freeze, doesn't get too hot, and uh, and grows naturally under shade. Of course, now there's a lot of sun-grown hybrids that produce a lot more, but they have a lot more costs for the environment. So um, it is interesting that coffee did not require a lot of special technology or effort to be planted in many places around the world.
But we still have to change the environment to plant it somewhere, though, don't we?
Well, usually what happens is that trees get cut down, especially in tropical montane areas that are often originally under forest cover. The easiest way to plant coffee is to cut down the trees and plant seedlings. Usually, at least in Latin America, you grow the seedlings under shade for a while until they're established, and then you plant them in the field. That way you can sort of like sort out seeds or seedlings that are not going to be productive. And I could go into all of the details about how you tell what a good seedling is, but I won't here. Uh, but farmers originally in Latin America, where I've done most of my work, but to some extent as well in Southeast Asia and Africa, started planting more coffee as part of an agroforestry approach. In other words, they planted coffee under fruit trees, native trees, other useful trees, and it became part of a highly complex canopy that allowed people to have a resilient source of multiple kinds of foods. And as the global system evolved, also to produce different kinds of things that they could sell to the market. And when you have a robust agroforestry system that characterized what some scholars have called coffee gardens, then you always have something that produces, no matter what the weather, whether it's good or bad or drought or rain or hot or cold, something in that highly complex agroforestry system will produce. So you always have something to eat, and you usually have something you can trade, barter, or sell out of this system. And it was really with the spread of colonial forms of agriculture that coffee became something that was more of a monocrop. And that really, that changed people's relationship to the land and was part of a whole series of transformations that occurred to the environment and societies as they became integrated, often by force and despite resistance, into colonial governments.
So coffee is, a global commodity. We've said this already. How do you see that as impact as on us as humans? Like how does coffee impact us as people other than, keeping us awake at all hours of the day?
Well, like many foods that are integrally part of our lives, they acquire meanings and values, often associated with the social contexts in which we consume them. So not just coffee, but many, many foods. If they're associated with socially positive interactions and contexts, they become something that has meaning and value for us beyond just the food itself. And especially if you think of coffee or tea, these are beverages that do not have a whole lot of nutritional value. They do have some, they're great sources of antioxidants, but they really don't nourish our bodies in a significant way. But because we are consuming them as part of our daily life, for many of us, it becomes like part of a morning ritual or something that makes, say, faculty meetings or meetings at work more agreeable. Um, Maybe not fun, but certainly enjoyable in some way. And food is one of the great things that brings us together. It's something that all humans share. And for many people, uh, coffee is part of that. And for me, for example, I really enjoy getting up in the morning. I grind my own beans, assuming I have time, make my own coffee, and that is kind of a peaceful and tranquil way to transition into what are usually really hectic, demanding days. And so coffee becomes something that kind of grounds me and gives me pleasure and joy. A very simple thing, not very costly. And I know a number of people have these things in their lives. And for a number of people, coffee becomes something that is a form of a comfort food.
Yeah, it's not like you said, it's not super high in nutritional value. It's more of a, I guess I'd say spiritual value because it nourishes your soul or whatever kind of
Mhm.
essence you want to call it. Some people call it one thing, some people call it another. But you go in a coffee shop and it's usually like a very relaxed, usually they have like a jazz kind of playlist going on in the background, and it's just a very like soothing environment. Assuming you don't go in first thing in the morning or around lunch, it's very soothing.
Yeah, it can be really, really hectic. And that's part of the way coffee shops were designed. Historically, places that sold coffee were social centers. It was where people could gather, and historically also were places where there was a lot of intellectual dynamism. There's a number of records that suggest that the French Revolution and to some extent the American Revolution were nourished in places that served coffee. And one reason is because, if you drink a lot of beer or alcohol, it sort of like dulls the mind. You drink in caffeine and you tend to get lively and perhaps impassioned. And it's a curious sort of loose correlation that in places where there's a dynamic coffee shop culture, there have also been social movements and movements of resistance and sometimes the rise of revolution. And it's also said that Newton developed calculus out of an argument he had in a coffee shop.
Well, I
There's
mean,
all of these kind of stories.
yeah.
But that seems to be true because people would meet in coffee shops in places like Oxford and Cambridge in the UK. People would gather there. Of course, at that time it was mainly men, but they would argue over, you know, different sorts of intellectual puzzles and place bets on each other or just have dynamic conversations. It was also a case that for many places, this was where political contestation occurred. And there are a series of monarchs and kings throughout Europe that systematically tried to eliminate coffee shops because they were seen as hotbeds of rebellion. So there's a really, it's here we have coffee shops as kind of a tranquil place, but we do also find coffee shops that are hosting book clubs and conversations or guest lectures talking about all sorts of things. So the coffee shop has this really sort of multivalent set of meanings and values. And it's kind of incidental that it's coffee, but I haven't found that same sort of pattern with tea. And I think it's probably just a historical sort of accident. But this is something interesting. Coffee is a lot more than the drink. It's all of its acquired social values and meanings as well. And in the present, this has also become a way that people have um, captured through the fair trade movement and movements for environmental sustainability to try to recognize the potential for consumers to change the way that market relationships work, which are often very exploitative and extractive of the people in the places that are producing things like coffee, but also sugar and cotton and other commodities on which we depend. And I find that to be one of the things that I have found really interesting to explore as well.
Yeah, it I don't think people, take the time to think about the way commodities like coffee impact us as a society. Like, yes, we know we run on it, we function on it, but it also doesn't just affect a single person. It affects, a majority of the people on the planet because they consume it in one way or another.
And I think that because of the way our society works, it's hard for us to really envision or understand the realities for people on the ground producing the foods and other things that we depend on. And so, a lot of people who are working on coffee can use this to illustrate the kinds of connections we have with people. And so we really are linked to people around the world by the things that we consume. And I think it's uh, a valuable thing for, you know, teachers like myself, but even just the average person to think about and to understand some of these connections and the potential that we have is in the aggregate to influence some of the ways that profits flow for things that we really appreciate, like coffee.
Yeah, I think that's accurate because, people they see coffee, but they don't see like the whole picture behind the coffee, like what goes into making it, how it gets from, let's say, the subsistence farm that it comes from to their coffee shop, to the cup, to the table that they're sitting at while they drink it.
Yes, and I think one of the things that has really been a wise strategy on the part of independent roasteries and coffee shops that want to have ethical decision making and fair distribution of profits is to highlight some of the individual coffee producers and communities where their coffee is sourced. And that's something that can happen with independent roasteries or coffee shops, and to some extent even if Starbucks provide like little stories about some of their producers. And that helps people to get a sense of a connection. Even though it's a very superficial one, these stories help consumers to realize that, there are real people with real challenges and problems, and not that different from us, who are producing coffee and other things that we need. And so, although we can also be sort of cynical about it and saying, oh, well, companies are just using the images and stories of these people to make money. One of the caveats is for people working in fair trade or direct trade, they are doing this because they want to make a difference and actually provide a price that covers the costs that coffee producers must invest to produce good coffee. And it also is based on relationships. So, while we can see these kinds of advertising approaches as uh, perhaps reproducing forms of exploitation. The thing to remember is many of these coffee producers have found that they themselves do benefit from developing these kinds of relationships. And they are proud of the work they do. And it's hard work, but they do it well and they produce something that has value and in general should be valued even more highly. I would argue that, a lot of the coffee we consume uh, is is being bought and sold for prices that barely, if at all, cover all of the costs and inputs that farmers and households and communities put into maintaining their coffee and producing a high quality bean. And now, one of the challenges is that there's a lot more good quality coffee available than there is demand. And so I feel like everyone who drinks coffee might want to consider choosing a coffee where they can actually identify where it comes from and possibly even who it comes from. Even if it's a symbolic link, that adds a dimension of meaning and connection and perhaps more thoughtfulness to the kinds of relationships that we have that may seem ephemeral, but actually are fundamental to the way we live our lives and the way the world works.
So, Catherine, we're about out of time for today. If people wanted to learn more about coffee or its historical impact or its social impact, really is the more important thing I feel like we covered today. Uh, what would you recommend they do?
Well, there are a lot of wonderful books that have been written by people, and some are for a public audience. One of my favorite books, it's a little dated now in some ways, but which covers the history and emergence and spread of coffee really well, is The World of Caffeine by Weinberg. And here, I've got it right here. So, Weinberg and Beeler. Uh, you see it? Sorry.
Kind of.
I,
I
I
can I
will.
can put I can put a link in the description so people
Yeah.
can find it.
Right. There are a bunch of books if you are more economically minded, such as Grounds for Agreement by Friedel and The Coffee Paradox by Benoit Davids. And so I can send those references too. Also, you can go to the Specialty Coffee Association website. It's the SCA, and it's the major association. It's global and has an awful lot of people throughout the coffee chain, the value chain, from producers, cooperatives, coffee exporters, importers, direct traders, baristas, independent coffee shops, you name it. They're probably a member of the Specialty Coffee Association, and they have a lot of material for all aspects of coffee production. You can go to the International Coffee Organization site. It's the ICO, and it has a lot of material on things like coffee production, uh, harvesting conditions, prices over time. You could go to the stock exchange and see how different coffee entities are being valued. I have a book too that tries to give an overview. It's for a general audience called Coffee Culture, and I'm happy to send a link to that. And it's also available electronically at a lot of libraries. So you don't have to, actually, many of these books are now available to ordinary, to the public or to people working in educational institutions. They're available online or in public libraries for the cost of signing up for a library card. So there's a lot of things that can be done from the archaeological past and origins of coffee throughout history to looking today. And I would also mention that they might want to go to the Fair Trade Organization, which is the largest organization for an effort for socially responsible and environmentally sustainable production. It gets an awful lot of criticism, but it's trying to make a difference in a world where you have to use all of the structures of the global market. You have to ship in the containers provided by the large container companies. You have to follow all of the rules for imports and exports. And so there's only so much you can do within a system that's pretty resistant to change, but there's a lot of effort happening for people to make a difference by their consumer choices, by what organizations they decide to support. A big one here in the United States is the Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee, which many people may have heard of. Also, Rainforest Alliance certified coffee, and of course, fair trade coffee and equal exchange. So there's a bunch of them that are trying to do a better job of having constructive rather than exploitative relationships with coffee producers. And I think that that's a very hopeful thing. And we need to focus on things that we can do collectively and in other ways as well. Plus, then you end up drinking better coffee.
Yeah. And that's really what it's all about, is having a very wonderful, fresh cup of coffee.
Yes. Yes. And I enjoy it much more knowing, for example, I have coffee that I buy from one uh, coffee producing member owned organization in Honduras, and they have really good coffee, and when I drink it I feel connected to these wonderful farmers who are doing some really innovative things.
Well, Catherine, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity. And you can also share my email in the information online if anyone wants to contact me directly with any specific sorts of questions. If I can't answer them, I'm sure I can find someone who can if it's about coffee. So
Well,
thank
that's
you.
going to do it for us today here at Archaeology After Dark, everybody. Tune in for more.
Thank you very much. Take care.